Aloha.
Hello. Mhm. If you want to see your fellow yogis on the other page. Mhm. Ah, good to see you. Just a sec. Okay. So let your attention relax and settle within your body or around your body. Remembering that quiet, a quiet heart or a quiet mind is not the absence of noise nor the absence of thought, not the absence of sound nor emotion, etc. So that this practice moves toward inclusiveness of whatever can possibly happen in this universe. When Tangpulu Sayadaw said to keep your mind like water, there comes to some level of understanding that every moment is changing, every moment is new, alive. Which includes that flow of Vedana, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral feeling tone. So again, that sometimes we can make that intention to just simply be with what is happening moment by moment, flowing, flowing with that change. And including when we feel like we have to slow it down, anchor, just be with the, just with hearing for example, to choose one sense door for a while. And just practice that sense of simply receiving directly. The textures and sounds just as they're happening. Just as they're passing. Noticing again that we can include the neutral. Often the silence has a neutral texture, including pleasant, unpleasant. And the more we're reacting to wanting things to be different than how they are, the more identified we get with that, the less quiet the mind is. But we can notice that at any time. It's like, oh, ha ha ha. The mind is sticky. It just can unstick. It's okay. The reaction is okay. And we just shift back into that flow, receiving texture, vibration, or the thoughts about what's happening. We shift to sound again. The sensations in our hands. Again, we kind of anchor the ship. Or the movement of the breath. And we can deepen that sense of exploration when we're aware that these sensations have never happened before. We really don't know what they are. And we can be interested in just these subtle shifts in feeling tone. Be very sublimely pleasant or neutral or unpleasant, not necessarily intense. Letting them be just as they are. So just like the weather can be calm and sublime, or a light wind, like the movement of the breath. Or a storm can come and we might have aversion to some unpleasant emotion. It's just the quiet comes from understanding how to connect the attention with not liking it. The awareness unhooks from it being personal, or mine, or I, or me. That unsticking allows for that weather front to come and go by itself. Just as it is. No problem. And sometimes when we cannot unhook, sometimes we can switch to metta, karuna, or equanimity, just things are as they are. Or feeling the goodness of the care of compassion and loving kindness. The hooking is also not me or I or mine. Stick exploring this aliveness of moment to moment, sixth sense door of awareness. With that intention to allow what is. Just as it is, without that need to control, judge, manipulate, fix. Just pure being with what is.
Thank you, Michelle. So we thought we would take some time again today to answer any questions if anyone has any about your practice, about the instructions, anything we might have offered recently, any way that we can be of support. And so again, the easiest way for us to know if you have a question is at the bottom of your screen, there's a reactions button. And there's a raise hand option. You can click on that. If that isn't working, you can just type into the chat that you have a question. We'll call on you. Try to grab our attention visually if none of those things work. Jean, hold on. There we go. Can you unmute? Great.
Hi there. Um, Kind of not well formed, but just a couple of things. I first wanted to say thank you so much for the Dharma talks, always, but I guess especially of the last few weeks. They've really been very moving to me. This deep appreciation for the instructions that we can kind of practice in our own directions, let's say. I think directions that have been traveled many times before by many contemplatives and yogis, but that happens to be our kind of unique combination of the moment and the offer of support as we kind of travel in ways that feel authentic to us and meaningful. Coming out of a tradition that was pretty tight and very this big assumption of knowing the way and telling all of us how to take one step after the next, I guess. It's like pretty tight. So it feels really I just have a lot of appreciation for that. So a friend of mine passed away recently. She came to this Sangha every once in a while. I think she sat with you, Jesse, in Western Mass. Alice Harrigan. I don't know if you remember her.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I just wanted to say her name and send her metta on her journey. I wanted to kind of ask the Sangha to, as you say, metta, just not to necessarily think of her directly, but just to send it to those of our Sangha who are moving on. And then I guess the last piece is that just with pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, I've been practicing with a little more lately. And it's so stunning how often I don't know whether it's pleasant or unpleasant or neutral. It's just like, right, you're just kind of sitting there going, oh, what is this? Is this pleasant, unpleasant? And then watching it kind of slide from one to the other. And so I just wondered your thoughts about practicing when it's kind of nebulous, would it be useful to shift the practice to something else if it is turning into kind of a bit of a wrestling match? Or it doesn't feel like wrestling. It just feels like, what is it? I don't know. And then, just kind of moving on to the next thing. So anyway, that's a lot, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jean.
Hmm.
I was gonna actually mention Alice today. And so thank you for, bringing her into the room, to the circle. Yeah, it's not, I didn't know her well, but it was just this, there was a Sunday sitting a few months ago, when I was in Bolivia, and I just noticed that she was in the hospital, just like on the screen. And so I got in touch with her and just wanted to see what was going on. Um, and I was just about to start my own retreat. Um, but I'm just so glad that we actually had that time. She reached back out and we talked for a while. Just sort of let me know a little bit about what was going on. I don't think she didn't convey at that point a sense of kind of um, any sense that her death was imminent. But it obviously was very serious, whatever, she had been struggling with for some months. And so Andrea Christensen, another person who sits with us, often, and she's actually got in touch with me last week to let me know that she had just passed away. And so, yeah, I just, I mean, I think that invitation for the Sangha of like, just to acknowledge, there are people here who know other people here well, maybe you've sat in person retreats for 40 years, uh, with Steve and Michelle or something. And then, many folks who maybe know each other a little bit, many folks who don't know each other at all, but sort of maybe recognize a name or a face just from Zoom. And people maybe who come more or less regularly. I think it was just an acknowledgement of this kind of quality of this aspect of sort of onlineness and Sangha that is not totally clear, right, in terms of what's the sort of the nature of these relationships and how do we keep track and honor, the presence and the absence of someone. So I want to go into that in a second, but first it was like very clear to me that it's like that was just by chance that I noticed Alice was in the hospital, right? It was like people were signing off, bloop, 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 bloop. And I was like, that's not a normal place, right? And great that happened. But also, like, if you are not well and you are in the hospital or something is going on, it's like, let us know. I mean, I think just to say we may it isn't clear how much we will try to attend to what we can in terms of like supporting you in your life with incredibly difficult things that are happening. And we recognize that we're not available for, you know, a lot of things in your lives. Um, and there's something about the nature of this dynamic that is limited in that. But in the case of like serious health realities, we want to know. And so please, not that we're going to be like the top of your priority, like letting us know. I mean, but just to know that it's like that we would like to know, and that it's important for us to have a sense if there is um, something that dramatic happening in your life. Um, so whether we can, directly support you, but also to sort of like have some sense of like being able to be a vehicle for others knowing, and to be able to have that level of sensitivity in this group, right? Of having an awareness if there is someone among us who is not well in a serious way. Um, and that there may actually, depending on where everyone lives, there may be actually very practical things that might be able to be manifested through that knowledge. And at the very least, a sense of caring. So, um, yeah, I do think it'd be good to just take a moment um, to just honor the life of someone who you may or may not have known. You may have seen her name on the Zoom square. You may have had an interaction with her. You may remember her from a retreat. You may not. But that recognition that a comrade has passed, someone who was part of this journey with you, with all of us, and had her own life, her own joys and struggles and challenges and hopes and aspirations and beautiful commitment to her practice in the path of liberation. And while there may be many details that are unfamiliar to you, we recognize that we come together every week, or we come together on retreats, or however we might name a sangha that's broader than this, that we have a sense of shared journey and the presence or absence of anyone along this path alongside us is honored, recognized, cared for. Just maybe taking a moment to feel into that honoring our own hearts, minds, bodies, and recognizing our own part, the benefit we receive, the responsibility we have, the value of our own presence or absence in this community.
Thank you.
Hmm. Michelle, anything you want to add or to go into about Vedana?
Vedana, yeah. I just want to say I think it's always a privilege to be able to get in touch with metta for someone who has died, and whether we know them or not, that wishing them well on their way is really a privilege and wonderful to practice. I was looking at the Satipatthana Sutta last night and was looking at the word Vedana and Jesse and I talked a bit about the word itself and how it's translated, and also how one word isn't, at least from our perspective, isn't possible to really convey the meaning of it. And also I think it takes many years of practice to appreciate that the first foundation of mindfulness, mindfulness of body, I think is relatively clear. I mean, we can talk about word hand, right? And at least it's clear, right? The word hand or the word body, and how we are mindful of it, of course, has a range of approaches for all of us. But when you shift to Vedana, I think it is it's such a critical, to me it's like such a critical foundation of mindfulness to understand how we suffer. Like, I just think the bottom line is to even appreciate a conceptual framework for Vedana is so stunning a teaching, so that to grasp that each moment of consciousness, really like this momentary change of consciousness, of knowing each moment of consciousness, seeing, smelling, tasting, touching, right, thinking, all the sense doors, each moment of them has a simultaneous, this is the part I love, it's a simultaneous pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral feeling tone. How do you translate that? Most people will hear, they say it, usually it's translated as feeling, and then it can get mixed up in our minds as emotion, but it's a mental feeling tone that is arising, passing as well each moment simultaneously. You can't translate that in one word, really. And then I think what you described, Jean, in terms of really just being open to exploring that, and to be able to say, I don't know, that's very wise, right? Like, it's very wise, because it's when the sensations are refined or light, they tend to be more indistinguishable, so dramatically, or easy to separate, and they're changing so quickly. But to be interested in it and to grasp that so much of our reactions to the appearance of pain, particularly intense pain, mental, emotional, physical, inwardly or outwardly, right? Or the pleasant, and our attachment to it, again, inwardly or outwardly, with any sense door. And then the neutral, of course, that is, for a lot of us, very much more difficult to sustain an interest in or awareness of. As you start to get interested in that, I think, and start to see that it's the kind of bare attention of it, the acceptance of the fact of it, that in itself is so liberating. The fact that there is pain, and the fact of there is pleasure, the fact that there's neutral, and that we never know what's going to happen next. And when you start kind of seeing the insight that can come into anicca, dukkha, anatta, and the depth and vastness of that, but also the freedom, really, the freedom of exploring aversion, attachment, and delusion in relationship to this. It's just, it's really a gold mine. So I appreciate the question, because I think that understanding, I remember giving a talk on this a billion years ago, understanding the nuts and bolts of suffering and how we get free of that is really so connected to the Vedana understanding. So I'm glad you brought it up. And in terms of practically answering specifically how that unfolded for you, it's okay not to know. It's like we're not meant to be nailing it shut and moving on. We can move on because we've worn out our investigation or interest in that time period. But to let it be not known, which pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, and to let it be, let it emerge as it is the most important part. I'll say one more thing about that, particularly when we're not having aversion, attachment, or delusion, right? If there was aversion, then you would tend to be able to find the unpleasant. And if there was attachment, you would at least have a memory of the pleasant, right? Or if there was boredom or indifference, you would probably be able to, again, at least reflect back on the neutral. And I think that most of my practice was that. And actually, Sayadaw U Pandita told me to practice it that way. He said, don't go looking for it, just notice, try to be aware of it when the reaction comes up. That was my early practice with U Pandita, but it was very helpful. Or it can get, like you said, it can get very, in some ways, unproductive. So yeah, good question.
I think one place that that I do find helpful, and it just kind of tags along with what Michelle was saying around investigation, that I do find that like the Vedana often has just an interesting relationship to investigation, and so like a couple examples of like sometimes it's when you're very sleepy and things are very kind of like the mind feels very mushy and maybe you're sort of like nodding off. Sometimes it's one of these things where you just know that it's very hard to investigate that, right? It's very hard to like kind of feel like the mind starts to get kind of be able to dig into anything because everything's sort of so mushy and the mind itself is so dull. That is an example of a time where sometimes looking at Vedana can be helpful, where you might notice that something like the sleepiness or the softness or the sort of dullness, like there is a pleasantness to that kind of cloud that's kind of calling you in, that there's something pleasant in it, and that's part of why it's so compelling, right? And that can just be enough to start to kind of find a place of interest, right? Where you're like, oh, that's interesting. And so that starts to kind of get a little bit of like the investigative wheel turning, or is this pleasantness kind of the softness of it, the kind of absorptive quality of that? Is it is it perhaps, might there be something unpleasant in another part of the experience that's kind of trying to be avoided, or feels overwhelming or something like that. So often it can be this sense of like you might not notice the Vedana, but you start to see this kind of critical role it plays in so much of the behavior of the mind, of why the mind moves one way or another way, so that you can kind of start to consider, oh, is there something unpleasant happening that is difficult, right? Or is there something pleasant? Whatever it might be. It's like to use Vedana that might not be immediately apparent as a way to sort of start to investigate in a deeper way what's happening in the present moment, can be really helpful. So again, sort of, as Michelle's saying, just to focus on it all the time is not usually very realistic, in terms of our practice. It's so fleeting. It's so difficult to see a lot of the time because it's so bonded to the experience itself, whether it's a physical or mental, emotional experience, or sensory experience. Um, to start to kind of discern the Vedana from the tactile nature of a physical experience or whatever, it's very subtle. And when you realize the velocity at which mind moments are arising and passing around every sense door, you don't have to worry too much about being that precise, because really, if you think about every mind moment having a different Vedana, of course there might be a sense of coherence, right? A sense of like this array of experiences is tending towards the unpleasant, or tending towards the pleasant. That sort of vagueness or lack of clarity is often what you're going to expect, in terms of what you're actually seeing. But you have a little bit of a sense of something, and you can kind of explore that to some degree, or again, using it as a vehicle for deepening our investigation, and investigation in like a Vipassana way versus investigation in kind of an intellectual way, right? And so anyway, I think it has a potential to be very crucial and very helpful in terms of that whole realm of what we think of as investigation in the practice. So yeah, great question. Sun, did you have a question? Let's see, hold on. Can you unmute there?
So I'm interested in mindfulness of the mind. So how do I do it?
How do you do mindfulness of the mind?
Yeah,
How's it?
because like when I read the Satipatthana, it's just like, no, the mind angry as the mind angry, the mind sad as the mind sad, but there's not much about it.
That's a
Well,
good.
Michelle just read it. Here we go.
Well, I didn't. I
You
was
got
sort
her
of.
at the right moment.
I got bogged down in Vedana, frankly, but I didn't. I decided to. I've been reading it. I'm going to read some more tonight. But that's a very good question in and of itself. Meaning that so much of the mindfulness world, traditional modern, is based on the Satipatthana Sutta. But if you actually read it and try to get a lot of practical ways of how to practice it, that's why I even brought up when Jean asked the question about Vedana, how you can even translate it well to inspire somebody to explore it really as practice. So I think that's always been my interest for myself or others, like how do you look at that, or look at the translations, and then to see, is there a way to really translate that practically to be inspiring to actually, be interested in exploring it. So, like, to me, your question in itself is what's important. That how do I actually explore the third foundation of mindfulness? Because it is described as like water in a glass. That if you put a dye in it, like that would be the anger, or like if you put a dye in it, that would be sleepiness, or that would be right attachment or grief. Or it's like, okay, well, okay, but then what? Then what do you do, right? I mean, that's what's so interesting about these practices. That I think that often the way we try to teach them is, first of all, to see that there's, say you're exploring, to backtrack, Vedana, then usually you're going to shift into a body sensation. And as Jesse was saying, often it's so hard to maintain a continuity with the Vedana. You will eventually be noticing something with the body sensations, whether it's soft or hard, right? So, and I mean, you can get like that example. It's in many ways, I think that that's why body is first, because it's much more tangible and it's much clearer how to work with it. Because with mind, the awareness has to be able to be interested in the knowing mind itself, which is actually quite refined. Like knowing is refined, and the awareness has to kind of find a way of opening up around that and going, oh, right, like I was really hoping I'd get to be interested in anger. Right? It's always a great accomplishment to be interested in an angry mind or a sad mind or a happy mind, or because it's much more refined, even though the anger can feel very intensely unpleasant. If you look carefully, it requires so much more investigation, because generally speaking, if we're angry, then there's content to the thought, right? The thought isn't, may you be happy, may you be peaceful, may you be free from suffering with anger. It's usually this often quite dramatic series of usually being right, or usually believing our judgments are right. So if we say, well, how do you investigate or be interested in an angry mind? Often we'll say, well, don't forget to stay connected to something neutral, because that perspective, like if the thoughts are angry and we're believing them more and more, and we're very identified, they're mine, they're I, they're me. These are all things, of course, that how I'm saying it is to investigate it, right? To actually ask ourselves, well, how does it feel to be identified with anger, right? But it requires so much skill. It requires the ability to recognize thinking and recognize the content of thinking. So to say, well, it's just the color of the water, in a moment-to-moment experience, somebody might have the predominant experience be just a very constricted heart center. It might be very tight, and maybe the body feels hot, and then the thoughts are very righteous. Do you see what I'm saying? So you're actually bringing in all four foundations of mindfulness to work with that third. And
So
that's
it's the
what's
same
so
with sadness.
What?
It's the same with sadness.
Well, I
Sadness in
think
the mind.
yes, the same. I don't like to ever say anything's the same, but I think that what's individual is usually what we have resistance to. So that some people might have a much easier time being willing to explore sadness, or they might have an easier time exploring aversion. And that's why this gets I just think I love it. I love the practice, and that how And not only can it be very individual, but yesterday you might have been open to sadness, but not today. Do you see? We are so changeable that we can't nail it down and say, I always am interested in sadness. I'm never interested in anger, or however it's playing. Or you never do this, or we never. It's not like that. It's momentary, and then that ability to have the conditions come together where, with sadness, universally again, often there's thoughts. And right, that otherwise, how do we even know we're sad? Often there's thinking, right? And often with sadness, there's an ouch. There's an ouch, like in terms of, I mean, there's so many ranges of why we can be sad. It can range from self-pity to taking in all the sorrow of the world, right? A death, loss of a friend, or etc. There's so much, but it requires going into the individual content and the thinking. Usually, not always. Sometimes we're just sad and sometimes we're inexplicably sad. But it's like there's a melancholy, and we'll usually encourage people to notice the body where it can be constricted in any way, but also to notice something neutral as a perspective, so that you're meant to be finding the anchor as a perspective and then going back into where it can be murky or clear. But often with emotions that are more difficult to be with, they're usually more easily to be identified with, and there's often more resistance. So it's helpful again to step out and go to what's neutral, so we're not getting caught in trying to fix or get rid of or get something with them. That's, I of course I could go on and on about this, but the four foundations of mindfulness are often moment to moment, very intertwined, like facets, different facets of a jewel. So it requires the skill of maybe honing in on one aspect that's presenting itself, but including the others as that moment to moment experience unfolds. Isn't that fun, son?
Yeah, but the mindfulness of the Dhamma is kind of hard to, because it's so general. And they usually say the Four Noble Truths and the 7 Factors of Enlightenment. So it seems like more general. But the mind is much easier for me, I think.
Mindfulness of mind is easier for you than all of, like you're saying, the
Dhamma, the fourth.
Right. Well, I know. I mean, it's framed in a weird way, the fourth one. In some ways, you could think of the fourth one just as like how all the other three unfold, like what is the relationship between mind and body and Vedana, like how do these things lead? So when you encourage certain mindful, qualities of mind, certain things unfold, or, what is in some ways, that's what I think of as the fourth of Dhammas, as like, what is the sort of understanding the interactions between the first three, really, Yeah. But
the fourth is also 7 factors or hindrances. It's like it's a big amount, right? Jesse, I agree with you. I'm just adding that in, that it's
yeah, but most of those still fall under mind, really, right? So I mean, they're aspects of mind, or anyways. Yeah. I mean, so I think one thing that I have found kind of interesting has been there's two things. It doesn't always have to be so precise. There was I think I've told the story before of like a monk I knew in North Carolina, a Burmese monk who I can't remember what happened exactly, but he was trying to get these different monks and nuns from different traditions in that a part of central North Carolina to like get to know each other. And so you invite them to like have lunch or whatever. And anyway, it didn't always go well because people did things differently depending on their traditions. And anyway, I think there was one monk in particular who he had like a little difficult time with, and he said that he noticed that every time the thought of this monk would arise in his head, there would be an unpleasant Vedana, and then he said it after 42 days. He noticed that when the monk, the thought of this other monk arose in his head, that there was no longer unpleasant Vedana, and it wasn't like he was trying to send metta all the time, or it wasn't like he made a big project of it, but there was something amazing in that to me of like he was watching his mind, right, in a way that was like very diligent and yet very kind of hands off in a way, but that he was tracking this experience, right? Not like getting upset about it, not necessarily making a huge project out of it, but he was watching how long it took for a certain kind of triggering around one experience to sort of dissipate, in his mind. And I thought there was something so like really inspiring about that, because it's like it was very simple but very powerful, really, to see, for him to know that about himself, and like how long it took for one incident to sort of start to diffuse in his mind and that reactivity. So I think that sense of just like watching our minds, that it doesn't have to be very intense, very technical, very precise, mind moments are happening so quickly, but it's still more amazing than just kind of generally watching your mind, right? There is this way in which it's like to really see the value of it, I think is really important. And then I'll just think one thing that might be something that might be helpful to you or others, it was helpful to me, was this question of you look in the like Satipatthana Sutta versus the commentarial tradition. And sometimes there are places where they're a little bit in conflict. So this question of, can you be mindful of anger, right? So in general, we will say that yes, you can. You can have mindfulness of anger. You can observe what's happening in the mind. You observe the phenomena that's happening in the body. You watch the interrelation of these things, right? But in the Visuddhimagga, right, technically, in all the the more kind of technical pieces that come more from the commentarial tradition, they'll say that there can only be one mind moment at a time. And so mindfulness is a wholesome mental quality, and anger is an unwholesome mental quality. And that actually those two things cannot exist at the same moment. But because they're happening so quickly and in such quick succession, that if mindfulness is coming kind of in between, chopping it up, that you are experiencing the rising of anger, you experience the passing away of anger. It might not be there in the moment, but there's still a way that mindfulness and anger can happen in a 5-minute window that leads to insight. But this question of what is really happening, so is just for some people that might be an interesting kind of experiment of, it's like, am I mindful of the sadness? You brought up sadness, so it's like, is there mindfulness of sadness right now, or is the sadness happening and then the mindfulness is happening and the sadness is happening and then it's dissipating? Like that sense of always going like more and more precise sometimes can make it interesting enough to wanna to feel like we're actually engaging it in a way that's different, Mm.
Yeah, but I forgot. Lately, I've been accept with aversion.
Wait, what about
aversion?
yeah? Right.
So yeah, whenever I think of the person, I can feel aversion arising.
Right. And going back to Vedana, it's like, what is the aversion to? Is it to the mental image of the person? Is it to, and is there an unpleasant sensation there, or is the unpleasant Vedana with remembering what they had done and what they said or their actions? So it's like you can always get more precise about what's the aversion. If the aversion is to an unpleasant Vedana associated with this person, what is that? Is it the sound of their voice, the image in their head, an argument, whatever it might be? So yeah, it's like finding your way in to investigate is, sort of the hard part, but it means like you're breaking up a little bit the belief in it.
Just the thought, and then his personality, and then it's a chain.
Yeah. A chain of sorrow. Thanks, son.
I think believing thought is a good place to investigate itself.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. When we're believing the thoughts is usually when,
yes.
that's all. Yeah, that's a great place to investigate.
Cynthia, you had your hand up. Do you still have a question? Oh, I can't hear you. Let's see. Can you unmute there? Let's see. Are you? I can't hear you, Cynthia. Are you muted? No. There we go.
Yourself. I did. Okay. Yeah.
Oh, you're in the same room. Okay.
I couldn't figure out how to ask the question without being totally nuts. So I decided not to ask it now. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Feel free to. As you know, questions don't always have to be totally coherently formulated. So if you change your mind, let us know. Yeah. Molly?
Yeah, let's see. So I am unmuted.
Yes.
So hi.
Hi, Molly.
So we live in Portland, Oregon, and just went through really extreme weather that ended up lasting for like 10 days. And Michele, you named my problem with extreme weather years ago as a karmic knot, which I have liked because it's more dignified than a phobia. So we didn't actually leave the house for 10 days. I mean, we would hold on to the house when we let the dog out. There were ice storms after ice storms after ice storms. And so it was like a retreat that I didn't sign up for. And went on and on. And so one question I have is, I can get into like, what is the process of dealing with karmic knots? Sometimes I felt like I was back at Hollyhock in the early 90s, and this doesn't feel any different. And and we were actually really lucky. We're the only people we know who didn't lose power at some point. But I didn't know that ahead of time. And I kept saying, as Michele says, anything can happen at any time. Anyway, So, anything that you might say about the process of dealing with karmic knots and when it doesn't feel like it's getting any better, or maybe it doesn't. Maybe that's part of the nature of karmic knots.
One of the things Jesse and I were just talking about this yesterday, but I think that it's kind of the nature of a karmic knot to look at other people's karmic knots and wonder like why there's there's that you'll hear people say why is that person still getting so caught in that, right? That it's like if you look at other people's, it's very easy to judge. But if you look at your own, you can hardly like get a handle of them, and that's the nature of it. That the nature of a karmic knot is to feel like it's a lifetime teacher, because it is. It's a lifetime teacher, and that sense of when you're really caught up in the doubt, like a great karmic knot thought pattern is, I haven't changed for 40 years. Right? That's if you notice that thought, I haven't changed since I first started practicing. That's usually a thought that you might just try to recognize as a karmic knot, because that it's the fear and the doubt will start like just getting so intensified, and that is as in terms of an army of Mara, fear and doubt, it becomes impossible to practice because the doubt just paralyzes us or cripples us, right? So, I mean, anything you can do usually to recognize that you're at the beginning, at the least, I'm joking because it's so hard, that one is triggered, right? One is getting triggered, one's going down, and getting to know yourself and getting to know what can maybe at least prevent further depths into the quicksand, right? Like you might not be able to get out, but at least, get a straw and try to get the air. You're still under there, but you're still getting some straw, like air. It's the getting some space. And that's very individual, Molly. I mean, were there things you could do that you did that you can look back on and say, oh, I actually got some space this way, or I got some space that way?
Well, I asked Cynthia and the other person we live with, Sky, like, well, what is this being like for you? And that was a straw, like, yeah, we're not liking it. We want it to change, but we don't feel like we're going to die. And also, they had so much compassion for me. That was really lovely, because they could have said, boy, you're driving us nuts. Don't listen to another weather report. And climate change is not making weather better. So, well, I did have knowledge of what it was, and naming it as a karmic knot is helpful. Thank you. And I noticed when it was better, and I noticed when it was worse. And I had times of having a good time, and that was helpful. So, but the doubt and fear, when that's around, are yeah.
I mean, again, the nature of doubt when it's a karmic knot is to feel like quicksand. And so I think that again, recognizing it, but also if you have to write it somewhere that you can refer to in the future, it's just like, even though I believe these thoughts to be true, they are not true,
Yeah.
right? Like, I mean, that's the key with doubt, is that we're so believing it, and it's that's where there's no space.
Yeah.
And way back, I remember I used to joke about it, but it's true. Like I would always say, "Oh, there's a recipe for this." So it's not just one particular condition. It's like, you make a cake. It's a recipe. There's a recipe for doubt. It's very unpleasant for you. It's very painful. And then, yeah, you said it. Then there's the aversion to it. Then there's the fear of it not going away, right? And you skid. You just swerve into the quicksand of the doubt.
And there's the feeling crazy and like I'm not one of the hundreds of houseless people in this city
Right.
that were not taken care of. All of that goes on. Yeah.
Yeah, well, just the reminder again, a karmic knot has the nature of life and death to it. It's a survival pattern. It's a preferable to the vulnerability.
Uh-huh.
It's Jesse, I'm sure, has some stuff to say, so I'll just finish that. It's just like the defense that you develop karmically as a kid, little, is that vulnerability is too intense to be with, that anything can happen. And it's the thoughts, believe it or not, are more preferable than the actual experience of the vulnerability.
Although I felt like I was feeling the vulnerability.
Yep, and that's where you're gaining a lot of ground.
And it doesn't mean it's going to feel better. I mean, it's like, that's exactly right. It's like, actually, you're like, this is why I'm avoiding this. This is like, of course you don't want to feel that, and you have an incredible system that has protected you from these horrible feelings. And now you get to feel them. We love Vipassana. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No,
Yeah.
I mean, I think, to us, what you presented is like it's like you just ran a marathon or something. You know what I mean? Like that's like you should get a medal for those 10 days, or it's like to really think about, of course, the nature, like Michelle was saying, the nature of it is to think, oh, I haven't made any progress, but when she also said it's like part of the nature and the most difficult thing around a karmic knot is that we tend not to see them in ourselves. We see them in other people, but we don't recognize them. And that's like where you started, which is that you recognize this. You recognize that when there is dramatic weather, you have a very deep, evocative, like emotional conditioning around that. That's very difficult. And not only did you recognize it and kind of worked your way through it, but that you were forced into that for 10 days in a way that was like, that's like torturous, right? And so but that you had these inner resources, you had these outer resources, you were able to call upon them, to recognize them, maybe not all the time, of course, right? But that you did essentially this classic Vipassana thing of like you break it up. What feels like a solid mass is not. And when you start to recognize it, it's not. That it's like, oh no, I had moments of fun. I had moments where I felt cared for. I had moments of whatever. It's like, oh right, this thing is not as solid as it appears to be and as we dread that it is. And that you make your way through it humbly because you do need help externally, right? It's that, but also with that sense of healthy pride, right? Of that you were able to recognize and manage and kind of navigate in the ways that you felt got you through it, and it's amazing. and and the acknowledgement that actually in all of it there are periods of understanding that vulnerability because you are able to feel it, right? That you actually don't need to be protected by it all of the time. You see why the mind does what it does to not feel it, but that you have the ability at times to be with that, and that it's really painful, that it's understandable why the system is trying to protect you from that, but that you are actually able to feel it and understand it and go through it again and again so that we start to understand more of the what leads to whatness of it all. It's amazing. It's really, really wonderful. Yeah. Inspiring.
Well, thank you both for taking notes and making a recipe for the next time. And also that book that you talked about a year ago, Michelle, The Woman in the Polar North, that really wonderful book.
Mm.
Well,
I kept
you
thinking,
must have just felt like you were there, right? You know, like if you with the ice storm, she used to just walk around the house like that. Remember, she would just hold on. She was way up in the Arctic, but during those horrendous storms, she would just hold on to the house to get exercise and walk around it if she could. But that, you know,
it's a
it
great
really
book.
made, yeah. But it also, you could see how it made her stronger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when she had a chance to leave before the end of the year, she didn't take it.
Yeah.
She stayed.
Yeah. So you were forced to stay for 10 days.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you both a lot.
Thank you, Molly.
Mhm.
Well, thanks everybody.
Have a great week. See you next Sunday.